Welcome back. This is Module 3c. We are going to be discussing in this module indigenous populations, the depopulation of the Americas, and then the colonial legacy that we'll see in Module 3d, which will deal with current separation and segregation in Anglo-America primarily. So let's get started. What we're going to be seeing is first this idea of First Peoples and Native Americans, and we really need to understand that the terminology here is important. Across the Americas, different terms and concepts are applied to peoples that were indigenous or are indigenous to the region. In the Canadian provinces, quite typically people use the term First Peoples. In the United States, we use the term Native Americans. And throughout Latin America, a diverse range of terms is applied to indigenous peoples, mestizo, and then various range of, in fact, authentic self-terminology for ethnic groups. So then we're going to move a little bit into the European colonial landscape. And then lastly, I'm just going to introduce the idea of ethnicity and slavery that we'll see in Module 3D. All right. So we need to start with this idea, and one of the important questions that really exists in contemporary geography of the Americas is how many people were here prior to European contact, and the numbers vary widely. Currently, most people have kind of settled in at about 50 million people throughout the Americas at the point of contact with Europeans. North America, somewhere around 3 to 4 million people. Mexico, by far the largest population, which is a little bit interesting in terms of the land area, roughly 17 million. The Central American mainland, probably 5 to 6 million. The Caribbean, roughly 3 million. The Andean chain, again, this we'll see this is the Incan population, the Incan complex, about 15 million, almost as large as the Mexican population. And then the lowland interior regions of South America, about 9 million people. So again, overall, roughly 50 million people. We can conceive of this, though, I want to point out kind of the range of numbers that have been thrown out. If we look at the lows and the highs, just for the Andes, the low numbers, some estimates put it as low as 3 million people. Others have estimated almost 40 million people. So we're talking about a tenfold uncertainty. We also see some numbers that we have to understand to some degree. Early estimates put North America, north of the Rio Grande, at less than 1 million. Others put it well over 10 million. Some of that comes from early studies that, in a sense, were trying to defend European colonization. And so if we saw lower numbers, that meant that the genocidal impact of European conquest would be less significant. So we have to be a little cautious of those low numbers. All right, so let's take a look at this. Now, what's important, what I want to do first is say, okay, again, think about roughly 50 million people throughout the Americas. Today, if we look at that distribution of population, what we see is that those numbers are dramatically lower. Again, if we look throughout the South and Central America, what we see is that in the countries of South America, we see very, very low numbers, roughly anywhere between 0.5% in Brazil, less than 1 million individuals today, to a high of almost 17 million people in Mexico that identify themselves as indigenous or of mixed ancestry. Now think about that. So 17 million people in Mexico, and that's essentially where we were in 1492. But if we think about the total population now of Mexico, nearly 150 million people, that represents a significantly smaller portion of the population. Now, if we look into the Americas, North America, what we see here, for example, in the Canadian provinces, the distribution of indigenous populations is still relatively high in the far northern territories. But as we move towards the U.S. border, and remember that's the area of the highest population density, that percentage drops dramatically. And in fact, in some parts of Canada, that approaches zero. So in a sense, what we see in the North American or Anglo-American region, and let's look at the United States, again, the same idea here is that there's virtually no Amerindian populations in the eastern part of the United States, somewhat higher percentages in the west. What we see in Anglo-America is the indigenous population being eradicated, extirpated, or moved. In the Latin American populations, there was much more of an assimilation and a mixing through marriage or through, in a sense, reproductive interaction. And so differences in terms of what was going on. But in any case, what we see is a radical change in the distribution of indigenous populations. Now, why does that happen? Well, the simplest answer we have to address is that starting in, obviously, 1492, European explorers and colonists moved into the Americas for the first time. When we look at Anglo-America primarily, although we can see excuse me, a bit of Central America here, we see British, French, and Spanish claims within Anglo-America and Central America. That occupation, that movement into the area, we will call, broadly speaking, the Columbian Exchange period. By 1750, the Central Europeans, that is the British and the French, had essentially claimed, although they certainly were not controlling, much of North America. Certainly by 1600, the Spanish crown had essentially occupied and in fact was actively controlling all of what we would call today Central America and in fact much of the Caribbean rimland. When we look at South America, we see a little bit different landscape. And it's important, again, this is a term you need to know for the quiz. The Treaty of Tordesillas. So the Treaty of Tordesillas occurs in 1494, and essentially what this did is it was negotiated largely by the Pope. So again, both Portugal and Spain are Catholic kingdoms, and in order to reduce conflict, the treaty was signed that essentially gave to Portugal everything between Portugal and essentially we go out as far as the coast of Brazil. Okay, and so really it's based fundamentally on distance from the Cape Verde Islands, but essentially, you know, what it means is Brazil becomes Portuguese. Everything west of that, and again in 1494 we didn't know what was west of that, but everything west of that became Spanish. So the irony of this, of course, is that the Portuguese were somewhat more aggressive in this, and they thought they got the better end of the deal, and in some respects they did because they got the east direction as well. They got all of what we today would call the East Asian region. What the Spanish got was the Americas, and what most important to the Spanish crown was the areas of silver and to some degree gold, but mostly silver extraction that occurred throughout Central America, especially in the areas around Veracruz as well as Cartagena. What we then see, though, is these two imperial forces, Spain and Portugal's exploration for resources, that fundamentally changes Central and South America. Unfortunately, this is where the story gets a little bit ugly. The conquest led to what there's no way not to see it as genocide. The Columbian Exchange, and the Columbian Exchange, we can again broadly state, is the exchange of cultures, technologies, and disease between Europe and the Americas. And for the Amerindian populations, it was devastating. Introduction of smallpox, introduction of measles, introduction of cholera. Many diseases came in that they had no immunity to. This is an image from the early 1500s in Mexico, and it shows the indigenous population suffering from the smallpox epidemics. And smallpox epidemics moved through the Americas and just devastated the population. Today we think of things like, you know, all of these apocalyptic movies, Walking Dead, etc. But I don't think we can appreciate the implications of 90% of your population dying in a decade. How much knowledge is lost, how much social order falls apart. These were catastrophic epidemics that came into the Americas. Now, unfortunately, not only that, and again, at some level, I apologize for this picture, but I think this picture is extremely important. This is a European engraving of Spanish conquest. And what you'll notice here is a whole population of Amerindians being hung. In the background, you'll notice conquistadors skewering and stabbing and killing, beheading indigenous populations. And then you'll notice, unfortunately, this terrible image in the front of a conquistador taking a baby and slamming it against a wall. This is the challenge that we have to confront in the Spanish and Portuguese conquests. These were active eradications of populations and enslavement. And the pictures get just worse and worse. If you'd like to look at these, that's fine. If not, but these are the cruelties. If you look above, you'll notice that this is an English translation saying the cruelties used by the Spaniards on the Indians. And again, a whole slew. Now, some have argued that this is, of course, the British showing how bad the Spanish are, and that it's reasonable to be careful and cautious with your interpretations. But there is always an aspect of truth of this, as well as some contemporary accounts by Spanish clergy that that demonstrate that pretty much all of these events did happen. Now again, we can look at these images again and again, and you'll notice the important idea here is that the mix of both torture, eradication, but also enslavement. The very important ideas here in the back of the enslavement of the population, which led largely to the decimation. In addition, when we put all of these together, what we see is a fundamental collapse of populations in the Americas. Take as a case and example, some estimates put, again, remember we looked at about 17 million indigenous population in Mexico. 1520, the first documented smallpox epidemic hits, approximately 8 million people in Mexico die. Second epidemic occurs in 1545, another 10 million deaths. By that point, the population has dropped dramatically. We're down to roughly 4 million people. By 1576, another epidemic hits, and we've essentially eliminated 90% of the population. 3 major epidemics within a 50-year period. The population of Mexico is absolutely decimated. It gets even worse when we look at the Caribbean estimates of the populations here. If you look at, again, this is Hispaniola, so Haiti, Dominican Republic, the first area of contact by Columbus, roughly 250,000 people just prior to 1500. By 1550, the population is gone. Essentially, the extermination of an indigenous population within a 50-year period. Why does this happen? Well, obviously, I've shown you the basic ones, but what we do know is that the Columbian exchange changed a number of things. First of all, obviously, we have the conflict and the active genocide. There's no way around. Both the Portuguese and the Spanish actively eradicated local populations. In addition, those that remained lost land. Those that remained were forced to grow different crops. Introduction of different crops, lack of stability of food, decimated the populations as well. Obviously, the introduction of disease was a major factor, and then enslavement. So in all of these factors, it's not surprising that we see a dramatic decline in population. Many have argued this is the largest genocide that has happened in human history, and it's one that we don't talk about perhaps enough. Now, what is the result? Well, to some degree, this act of genocide cleared the landscape of indigenous populations. That's not quite that simple in Latin America, because throughout the region, again, notice here the Portuguese populations in the east, the Spanish populations in the west, there was in South America somewhat more intermixing of the races, and so the growth of what we call a mestizo population, that is a mixed parentage, Iberian, Spanish, Portuguese, and indigenous. And as a result, we do see somewhat larger percentages throughout Latin America, and especially in South America, of indigenous or mixed parentage individuals. We also see, though, this difference there, and we'll get this later on, is this idea of this early transformation in Latin America from colonies to an independent landscape. North America, obviously we know the history of the United States and its independence, but a similar transformation occurred in South America, in which these large swaths of land became independent relatively early on. Virtually all of South America became independent by the 1820s. Virtually all of Central America became independent by the 1820s. If you look at, obviously, North America, we think of the United States being independent 1776. Canada is a little more complicated. Canada really doesn't begin to gain significant independence till the 1860s, and in some respects, throughout the 20th century, its ties to the United Kingdom were significantly stronger. The other point I want to make, though, is that throughout the Caribbean, this rimland region, you'll notice how much later independence moved through there. In fact, independence in the Caribbean did not make significant movements until late in the 20th century, in fact, after World War II. Now, what do we see today? Well, again, this last point that I want to make before we move into the next module is how all of these factors, the eradication to a large extent of indigenous populations, the colonization by different European powers, changed the cultural landscape. And one way of seeing this is language. So let's real quick, I want to point out, this is the Canadian provinces, and this is population speaking English at home. And what you'll notice is that the English-speaking Canada is south and west. Essentially starting in Ontario, we see significant portions of the population speaking English primarily at home, and that's a really good way of understanding culture. When we look at French Canada, again, French colonization, we see this very strong Francophone Canada, the Quebecois region, again in Quebec, moving into Newfoundland and Labrador, and into the maritime provinces. The indigenous languages, again, far to the north, significant populations remaining there that speak indigenous language. Okay, that's it for Module 3D. I'll come back, or I'm sorry, 3C, and I'll come back with Module 3D. We'll look at contemporary race and segregation in the Americas.